Greetings, Zero and Repeater Books readers. Today's guest needs little introduction, and I'm sure many of our listeners will know him from his own podcast, What's Left of Philosophy. However, for everyone else, Dr. Gill Morejon is a specialist in Spinoza and continental philosophy, and is one of the academics most responsible for bringing French Spinoza scholarship from philosophers like Alexandre Mathurin and François Zurabishvili to an English-speaking audience. He has also recently released a book of his own, titled The Unconscious of Thought, in Leibniz, Spinoza and Hume, which he has kindly agreed to speak with us about today. On a personal level, I've had many occasions to use Gill's work on Spinoza in my own research, and I'm particularly excited for this opportunity to discuss his work with him. So, Gill, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for having me. It's really great to be here.
To just start us off then, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your research, as well as what it was that brought you to the subject of your book?
Yeah, sure. It's work that, grew out of my dissertation, which I undertook at DePaul starting a couple years ago. You and I were just speaking beforehand, as we were just mentioning, I used to work a lot more directly on those. And initially, I was most interested in these thinkers in Leibniz and Spinoza and in Hume, because they're sort of formative influences for him and they're constant sort of points of reference for the development of his own philosophy. And as I kind of worked on them more, I came to realize that I found them interesting in their own right, obviously. And so kind of Spinoza most of all, although obviously Leibniz and Hume are very important to me as well. And at the same time, I'm a fairly committed leftist, and I'm really interested in questions of political theory. Another famous French Spinozist, you mentioned Mathurin and Zurabishvili, who are really, really wonderful, but Althusser is quite important to me. And I spend a lot of time thinking about problems of ideology critique. And I was thinking about how to sort of pull resources out of these early modern thinkers for kind of supplementing a project of ideology critique, for kind of grounding theoretically what it is that we're doing when we try to make claims about someone being kind of beholden to an ideological formation or, captured in Spinoza's language by inadequate ideas. And in the process of sort of thinking through this, I started to realize that one way of explaining what I thought was useful and helpful about these thinkers in this context was that they all, it seemed to me, had a kind of functional understanding of there being parts of the mind that are not conscious, and not just sort of negatively, right? Not just like, there's stuff that I'm unaware of, but that these unconscious aspects of the mind play significant roles, like effectively speaking, in terms of determining how people act, what their volitions are, what their desire looks like. And that this sort of unconscious aspects or dimensions are kind of so structurally, right? It's not sort of accidental or contingent. And so this kind of gave me a way to sort of systematically read these three thinkers together in a sort of discussion about, what is it that the mind starts to look like if we take seriously this sort of unconscious that doesn't look very Freudian either, right? It's, one of the polemical ways I can put the book is that, there's a functional understanding of the unconscious of the mind already going on in, the late 1600s, well before Freud, certainly well before the school of thought that kind of grows up around his work. And it has certain sorts of different assumptions and different presuppositions, and I think gives us a little bit of a different way in to asking questions about, how does desire work? And why might there be aspects of our desire as political subjects, as living beings, that is inaccessible to our own conscious reflection in a way that might be different from, say, like, a Freudian theory of, repression or trauma. So that's the kind of like really overarching kind of thematic through line. It drew me to emphasize specific parts of these thinkers' theories of mind. I think I say this in the book, maybe overcorrect a little bit. I think that there's a kind of prejudice in a lot of modern philosophy to overemphasize consciousness as the kind of central or essential feature of thought. And I wanted to insist that there is like, a very robust domain. There's a whole territory of unconscious thought that deserves to be explored. And for us to sort of ask about how that conscious part of the mind changes, like looks different to us if we give that unconscious aspect its pride of place as something that really does play a role in shaping how we live and how we understand ourselves.
So I've spoken with a bunch of different people now at this point, also working in early modern philosophy and sort of Kant scholarship, which at this point is like bizarrely its own thing and also extremely prominent. And something I found among a lot of people is that they have a similar kind of story about like encountering these people through Deleuze's works and then kind of shooting off in their own direction. I know this is the case for Martin Lin, who is a very, very big contemporary Spinozist. He talks about this in his, I think it's like 3 a.m. interview. And there's also a professor in my own department, Alice Cohen, who is our Kant scholar, who got into Kant after reading Kant's Practical Philosophy, or sorry, Kant's Critical Philosophy, which is Deleuze's book on him.
Yeah, the Deleuze book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But something I've noticed is that for a lot of people who start off with these thinkers through Deleuze, they always have a slightly idiosyncratic way of approaching these thinkers, which is, frequently a very good thing because it brings something fresh to the scholarship on them. I think this book, I hope you don't mind me saying, is in many ways a kind of paradigmatic case of something that surprised me while reading it, is that although it's, broadly a work of scholarly exegesis on some of the main philosophers from the early modern period, it both opens and closes with discussions of a markedly late modern or contemporary ideology. Yeah. I mean, obviously we have superstition and Spinoza, but I think they're still relatively distinct.
Yeah.
You also note that many conceptions of ideology frame it as specifically a kind of conscious mechanism, perhaps something that can be challenged by facts, reason, and logic. In a sense, your book is an attempt to understand like what the unconscious is, what unconscious ideology is, as well as how the conceptions of the unconscious offered in Leibniz, Spinoza, and Hume uniquely support this conception of ideology. I was wondering if you could speak at all to what it is about these authors which makes their understandings of the unconscious well suited to this purpose, and maybe how like unconscious ideology would have to differ in your view from a conception of it as something essentially conscious.
Totally. So like, I mean, the I think you put your finger on like part of my frustration with that conception of ideology as being essentially conscious, which is that you get this, we'll defeat it in the marketplace of ideas with facts, reason, and logic. And that just doesn't work. That just doesn't work, right? Like there's no reason to hold to a conception that tells us that that's the way forward after you've actually had arguments with reactionaries a couple of times. I think, another way of getting at that, like I know I've talked about this in other places, but an extremely important book for me is Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew, which makes this case very, very clearly about anti-Semitism, which, someone who is like ideologically beholden or is committed to a particular ideological representation will tell you that the reason that they hold the beliefs that they do is because they've looked at the facts and they've applied reason and logic and they've come out on the other side with this conception. And that's just not accurate. That's not true. That there's a way that ideas do work in spite of our knowing better. And for Spinoza, for instance, this is, I think, really, really clear. Like you mentioned superstition, he'd tell us to just stop arguing with the religious zealot if you read like theological political treatise. And I think there's something similar in Hume. I think Hume is, by the way, like a very, I think I say this in the book at some point that, his claim at the end of book 1 of the treatise that, reason isn't only ever ought to be the slave of the passions could be a maxim for ideology critique. Like, it's very frustrating for those of us, I think, who end up in something like philosophy, initially drawn to it because, we like to be right about things and we like to have reasons for the things that we hold and why, to realize that actually gets you very little in terms of, challenging the ideas that other people have. And Spinoza's constantly quoting Ovid, the Metamorphoses, right? The Latin video meliora provoque deteriora seclor. That is, right, I see what's better. I affirm it. I understand it. And then I just do the worse anyway. And I think that there's like something similar in Hume. Habit is very thick. It's very sticky. It doesn't actually do to just explain to someone that their habits are wrong, that their habits of acting, but also their habits of understanding. In the Hume chapter, I try to make a point of how even like, our sort of everyday processes of making sense of things or of understanding conceptually is thoroughly habitual for Hume. There's kind of no outside to habit. As a result, when someone tells me that, the habit that I've got of understanding something in a certain way is misguided, I can be like, oh yeah, that's true. I see how logically that doesn't work, but that idea is still there. That sort of sedimentation in my mind of which I'm not like consciously, reflecting on at all times. that sort of association between ideas that I have formed in experience, contingent, arbitrary, and demonstrably false though it may be, that association remains. Habit is something that can only be kind of corrected through, a very long kind of ongoing incomplete process. And I think that this is sort of true about ideologies as well. I mean, like, I spend a lot of time teaching things like business ethics. And as a Marxist, I'm constantly trying to like draw people to the conclusions that I'd like to see them reach about how, the discourse would have it that like the discourse of business ethics, that is, would have it that like, we're dealing essentially with the realm of bad actors occasionally, many of whom do want to do right. And, it's a matter of like educating, right? We need a kind of process of acculturation for those managers and corporate leaders who will come to see the error of their former ways and instead sort of adopt good corporate social responsibility codes. And it's just not enough. It's just not enough for anyone to consciously recognize that, oh, actually, like the exploitation of labor is bad when, on the one hand, the sort of material objective dynamics are such that that remains like forceful, even if I think that I don't like it. And on the other hand, there's all these kinds of like, deep associations in our current contemporary sort of situation between, for instance, the accumulation of wealth and merit. All of our wealthiest members of our society, people tend spontaneously to think that they must have earned that somehow, that perhaps this reflects, some kind or another of deserving, whether that's hard work, thrift, or intelligence, even in the case of like, a Musk or what have you. And you can point out that they're wrong about things, and it sort of doesn't get all the way to challenging that association, that sort of assumption. So kind of deeply rooted it is in our kind of culture and our discourse. So, Leo, I've talked a little bit about Spinoza and Hume. Leibniz is a bit of a trickier person to kind of bring into this discussion, which is interesting because I think at the same time that, he himself fairly conservative politically, although I'm not really interested in any of their politics. I'm kind of more interested in their theories of mind and the kind of metaphysics of ideas that they're sketching out in their various sort of projects. Certainly, Hume was also kind of a conservative in certain ways, although he was opposed to whatever. We don't need to get into all that. Leibniz, pretty conservative and harder to speak specifically to these questions about ideology, although maybe interestingly, he's the one of these three who comes closest, I think, to actually articulating explicitly that there are, unconscious perceptions, that there's unconscious affections of the mind, with his distinction between perception and apperception. And so he's got the kind of best worked out account of my being affected in ways that I'm not aware of can become something like the habituation of a consciously recognizable idea or perception or association of ideas. And again, not always obvious, what there is to do about that other than to recognize that, the accounts that I give of myself for my beliefs in conscious terms is only ever part of the story, and one that maybe doesn't even get at what's most important in determining me really to act in the way that I do. In a recent episode of my own podcast, as you brought up, we had Martin Hogland on, and he said something about how, like, it's a tricky position for those of us on the left who, whether we like it or not, every time I go out to the store and buy something, I'm implicitly kind of reaffirming this structure of value that this capitalist society holds. And that sort of happens below or beneath my consciousness, and in spite of my conscious opposition to it, right? So that's the sort of way in which I'm trying to get us to think about how unconscious ideas play a role in determining us. They have a real effectivity. They don't need us to recognize them. We can think they're wrong, and that doesn't mean that they don't have determining power. So last thought before I I'm going on too long, I think, but
no, please carry on. It's interesting stuff.
But I take it that, like, the thing about ideas is that I gauge their reality by their ability to produce effects. And for most of the time, what that means in what concerns us, that means whether or not they actually do partially or, to a greater or lesser degree, determine people to act in certain ways. And the question of whether it's quote unquote true, a given idea at that point, is wholly beside the point. And I think that Hume, at least, and Spinoza are very much conjoined on this issue. That, Hume says again at the very end of the first book of the treatise, he's like, whoops, I've just done a whole lot of work showing you quite carefully and rationally and logically through like, sophisticated conceptual analysis that a lot of the stuff that I thought I knew I don't know and can't. What are you going to do? That doesn't stop me from thinking that there's a causal connection between the billiard balls when I hit one into the other. And the fact that it's not demonstrable, that it's not demonstrably certain that there is such a connection, doesn't stop me from acting in ways according to my intuition that something like that is right. So I think this does sort of minimize the role that we can expect something like rational argument to play, right? We're not going to just get out there and bust out the facts and logic. But I think it does also kind of reframe or reorient, like, if it's not like that rational work will just solve the problem for us. It's not as though there's no work for critical rational reflection to do. It just has to be work done in the awareness, right? In the context of the fact that we're dealing with human beings whose minds are going to continue to work with associations that we think we can demonstrate to be false, right? So it does become a kind of like realpolitik of ideas or something like this, where it is a question of what works at the level of like, talking about, what we understand to be the case about ourselves and the world that we live in, because that matters, as far as I'm concerned, more than whether people, when asked, admit to thinking X, Y, or Z.
As you were saying that, I know earlier on you mentioned Sartre's anti-Semite and Jew, but you also made me think of a short piece that he wrote called Elections, a Trap for Fools, where, well, at least when you were talking about, you're walking around the supermarket and then you're implicitly, almost accidentally, let's say, being interpolated by your existence within a certain space and the sorts of actions that you're exercising. It's not something you're necessarily purposefully doing. As far as most people are concerned, they're probably just, I don't know, going to the store to get some milk or something, right? But there they are in the midst of ideology, in the belly of the beast. And I think there's something kind of similar almost going on in what Sartre has to say in his critique of electoral practice. That is, you think you're doing your duty as a citizen of a supposedly functional democracy. I think we're having some doubts about that right now in the UK.
Really?
Actually,
I don't know. It's none of my business.
A couple hours ago, they announced that Rishi Sunak is the new prime minister. Waiting to see how that one goes down.
Well, we'll see. See if he can beat 45 days, right?
Well, I think he just might, unfortunately. But what Sartre seems to have in mind isn't like people who go to elections and participate in putting their votes, their ballots into boxes are being bad people, or are intentionally supporting the kind of systems of oppression that many of them think they're about to vote out of existence. What Sartre has to say instead is that the way that this kind of balloting process works subjects everyone in it to a kind of serialization. So there's a kind of continuity between that and the critique of dialectical reason. I've not actually had the opportunity to read Anti-Semite and Jew, but I imagine there's some similar stuff going on in there.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And so I mean, part of what's interesting is the anti-Semite becomes for him the sort of like maybe best example of like a person in bad faith, which for those of us who like Sartre, by the way, is a much more comfortable place to be than like the standard other formulations where he's like, look at this waiter or women. And it's like, Jean-Paul, please. Oh my God, you're killing me. Where instead he's saying, this is someone who completely abnegates responsibility for their situation and the world in which they live. And, if things aren't working out for them, the reason why isn't because of objective structures, material, political structures that can actually, go out and like be worked on or about which anything can be done. It's this shadowy cabal, right? Which is why anti-Semitism is the sort of matrix of all of all conspiracy theory and maybe even of all ideology critique. It is a misdirect, but one that importantly gives that person the out, right? They need not assume any responsibility. And, he says some very damning things toward the end of, I think it's the first essay, the first of four, maybe it's the second. I think it's the first, where it's like, this is someone who will be anything but a person, be anything but someone who assumes responsibility for their actions. And so there is like a sort of auto serialization there. The thing with electoral politics, I think I should say here, is that like, I am not a person for whom you're just a dupe if you go to the polls or if you try to vote for someone who, in your estimation, would hopefully instantiate or implement better policy from the perspective of like, real effectivity. But I also think that like it's important in a kind of way here with Sartre to insist that that shouldn't be the end of politics. That shouldn't be the end of your political engagement. That, like, local organizing, mutual aid programs and things like this are crucial, not as, again, panaceas or solves, but they're, ways of actually being active. If we want to use Sartre's concepts here, right? There's no way, I don't think, to, participate in organizing a workspace that remains serialized. That's an opportunity for, doing something like belonging to, or even hopefully activating a group infusion, right? That's like his operative distinction there. And in any case, right, like, it's certainly true that for the majority of people that, of whom I'm aware in the US, they tend to think that, going out to the polls once every 4 years means that they are actively and effectively participating in what we all assume to be a functional democracy. Again, questions are possible here. And it's just not. It's not enough, certainly. And it's not even clear, for reasons having to do, I would say, with, the relationship between capital and the state under present configurations, things like regulatory and legislative capture, certainly like undemocratic institutions like here in the US, the Supreme Court. It's not clear that even if you did your voting, that would count as meaningful participation in democratic polity. But even if all of that stuff weren't the case, does that get you to where you can say that, you've, been responsible for the state of affairs in which you live? And I think Sartre is correctly pointing out that that's not enough. So there, I think I'd agree with him. But I just wanted to be clear that any listeners out there who think that you should vote against a reactionary, yes, go ahead, please. I think that'd be good. We should vote them out when we can.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to put you into a corner there. I brought that up to say, like, yeah, I guess what you said, I know this is a tangent and it's not necessarily related to your book, so this will be the last thing I ask on this. But like, this way of looking at politics and even ideology raises certain difficult questions, possibly, for understandings of international justice as well. Yeah. Like, if we're talking about the failures of American democracy, that also raises questions about, let's say, feelings of injustice in Haiti right now, right, which is about to experience yet another American intervention in their country. If you're someone living in Haiti, who are you supposed to be upset at? Surely not the average American voter. Is it the institutions themselves? Is it the leaders? Probably a bit of both.
Maybe both. Yeah, probably both. I don't know. It's very difficult to, I think this is part of a strategy that, I don't know, we might ask whether or not it was to what extent it was intentional, where the sort of objective institutional structures of American imperial hegemony, especially, but also how that, again, like, is interfacing with the interests of capital through things like large multinational and transnational corporations, is such that assigning responsibility in any kind of meaningful, localized way is like almost impossible, like, in principle, right? Like, this is extremely difficult to do. And, this is, it's at the same time, right? Like, sometimes we can find, like, particularly bad actors who are holding the levers of power, but it's often not that simple. And when it's not that simple, it does require, I think, a shift in the sort of analysis that one is doing of a political situation where, I don't need to be able to point the finger at any particular leader to condemn, these actions on the part of American imperialism, and to say that they ought not to be done, obviously, and that these are, unjust things that repeat in a horribly tragic way the sort of worst excesses of the violence of colonialism, right? And it can't be justified. It just can't be justified. I don't need to be able to point to any one person or group of actors for that to be the case, And frankly, at the same time, if someone from Haiti wants to point the finger at me and say, hey, did you vote for Joe Biden? I did, The part of, like, there's like an argument against participating in electoralism that I think comes from, like, a kind of beautiful soul logic, right? Where it's like, yeah, but if you vote at all, this is you being signatory to a system that will commit violent, criminal acts, and to which you are, if not, like, if you're not, like, full-throatedly endorsing it, you're a tacit signatory in some way. And I get that, but I do think that, like, these things need to be sort of brought into a sort of more materialist analysis, right? And situated at the proper level. But again, if anyone wants to condemn me for having voted, I get it. I'm not thrilled about how any of this is going. And I wish I didn't have only the options available to me when the voting time came around last go around. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, let's bring this a bit more on topic now then.
Yeah. Anyway, my book's about early modern
Yeah.
metaphysics.
Well, not strictly, and that's partly what I find so interesting about early modern metaphysics as well, because it's seemingly a lot more socially and politically engaged than what I think passes for most of metaphysics today. I read this really fun piece, I can send it to you afterwards, written by, I think he's like my second cousin or something, a guy called Neil Van Leeuwen, who teaches philosophy of mind. But like, he has an article where he poses the question to readers, look, you want philosophers to be more politically engaged. Here's the trade-off. You want Saul Kripke as a political commentator. Do you really want that?
Is that what you want? I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe. I don't know.
But yes, this whole politically or socially engaged way of doing metaphysics, I think, is one of the hallmarks of philosophy during this period. And something that really comes to mind when talking about this, and frequently does, is Terry Eagleton's book, The Function of Critique, because it kind of tries to trace back the origins of, in a certain sense, this conception of ideology that you're trying to deal with. This idea of a rational subject that's fully self-transparent, that sits in like some sort of wealthy cafe, having erudite discussions with other intellectuals present there, right? And usually with incredibly pretentious names like Francois.
Fancy.
Yeah, that was Voltaire. But like, this is all kind of contemporaneous with the discussions that you're talking about in the book. At the same time as you have Voltaire say, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. You have this fascinating conception of the unconscious being developed in Leibniz and Hume. Of course, Spinoza was dead by this point. So like, I want to ask you about not Voltaire, but the person who I think exists as your foil of choice in this book, which is Locke. You talk about him quite a bit.
Oh.
Balibar, in his book Identity and Difference, notes that the word consciousness, at least as we use it today, only really came into its familiar philosophical sense in sort of 1678, and it was in 1690 that Locke published his essay concerning human understanding. So in a very real sense, our modern concept of consciousness traces back to the discussions in which Leibniz and Hume were involved. On the other hand, it might be interesting to hear you talk about where it is that this idea of the unconscious comes from. Like, what was its prehistory before Spinoza? And just how did Spinoza, Leibniz, and Hume each espouse it? Like, what are the differences between what they do with that prehistory?
Yeah. Such a good question. There's so much there. So yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right. The person who I'm probably meanest to in the book, and hopefully not unjustly, is John Locke, who I dislike immensely, both for his politics and for his epistemology, which I don't think actually is particularly good. And it is like with him, like, yeah, he's sort of one of the founding figures of this kind of modern doxa about, you know, at least what's meaningful about thought being identical with consciousness or consciousness of a particular idea. There's a bit where I discuss a section in the essay concerning understanding where he says that, you know, if someone were to try to talk about an idea that someone has in their mind, but of which they are not conscious, he says, like, that is a square circle, right? That is a contradiction in terms. You may as well not say anything at all. There's nothing to be said about it. So that, like, the whole, you know, domain of legitimate philosophical inquiry about minds and how they work is what is conscious in them. And I think that this is a huge methodological mistake. And Leibniz is someone who responds to this specifically. And this is in the preface to the new essays, which is, by the way, like a brilliant text and a literary like abomination. I don't know if you've ever looked at it, but it is presented as a dialogue, but it is a dialogue between like one guy who's just reading block quotes of Locke's essay, and then another guy who's like, yeah, I don't think so. Here's what I think instead. It just says Leibniz's position, which is like, I don't know what you call that, but
early modern philosophical dialogues are some of the funniest things.
They're so funny, and this is like a pretty egregious example. But he says this about Locke in the preface. I think it's in the preface where, you know, he's, you know, looking at this claim of Locke's that, you know, thought and consciousness are coextensive, and he goes, this person can't really mean this. This can't be really your position. You wouldn't be able, if you bought that, to explain habit. Actually, I wouldn't be able to explain why people do things habitually. These aren't objects of reflection a lot of the time, or conscious awareness. And it wouldn't be able to explain how it is possible for, say, me to like remember things that like at the time I didn't notice, but which I recognize in retrospect that it was making an impact on me. The sort of doctrine of identity that we get, the identity of a subject in Locke, is that of a unity of consciousness over time. And in some ways, of course, this is fairly plausible. But all you need is a Leibniz to come along and be like, I'm sorry, do you never sleep? What are you talking about? Right? Like, this isn't a frivolous objection. It is a problem for this theory of what constitutes an individual as a subject. If there are breaks in that continuity of consciousness, as there are for me every day. And then it turns out that, from that sort of starting point, Leibniz is going to proceed to ask a bunch of questions that one of the things that I try to show in the book is that he notices these sorts of problems and then has to follow it out. And he's kind of quite honest in ways that I think are detrimental to his own commitments, that he wants to try to save a certain conception of subjective or agential freedom for me as a mind or an individual monad, that I think this theory of unconscious perception actually quite seriously jeopardizes. Where, I want to be able to say, he says, for instance, that, if I'm given two identical seeming options, right? That to me, I could, we're doing our Bird and Zast thought experiment, right? I got one option over here and another option over there. They're equidistant. They both seem equally attractive. Do I choose one or not? And he says, yes, of course you do. But not because you just like chose one for no reason. There were, as he says, like kind of infinitesimals of perception that, exist below the threshold of my conscious recognition of them, right? I can't consciously see them, but which make one of these an actually more attractive option for me through now an unconscious determination of my volition. And that's fascinating. And I think you can do a lot of work with that. One of the examples that I like to use here is like, I very rarely am conscious of the way that, all of the tiny differences in, say, packaging of a consumer good on the shelf. There's just an array of different options. And, this bottle of shampoo has got a slightly different color than that. And on the one hand, like, I can recognize that and be like, okay, yeah, I find green better in this context. Why? I don't know. A habituated set of associations. I might not even notice that the color is playing a role in determining my volition when I finally choose one of these over the other. These are things that kind of accrete in experience and which I'm not conscious of in the moment of their accretion. But absent which, so many of my very basic day-to-day decisions, actually would be unintelligible, right? I'd have to fall back on something like, which Spinoza is going to deny entirely, like a spontaneous volitional freedom of the will, where I just, for no reason, I choose that thing rather than this. And if I'm pushed and asked why that's the case, I have no reason. I just willed it as an answer, which for him is metaphysically impossible. And I'm inclined to go in a direction like that as well. I tend to be more of a determinist. But the reason why is less for the metaphysical commitments. Do you have to buy all of book 1 of Spinoza's Ethics on the nature of God? I don't think so. I think I can make the case quite simply is that, if I don't buy that there are reasons why people do the things that they do, I'm just admitting that they're unintelligible in principle, that I can't say anything more. There's nothing to understand then about human action. Why did you do the things that you did? Why did you vote the way you did? Why do you take this or that policy to be more important? And if the answer is, I don't know, no reason, well, then we're done. We have no further conversation to have. It's not clear how any further inquiry would even be possible. And for those of us who think that, what these decisions are that matter, or that they matter, that's a very frustrating place to be, just kind of axiomatically. If instead I say, well, look, there are always reasons, and oftentimes I'm not consciously aware of them, right? That there are these reasons why the preference takes the shape that it does, which are not always available to my conscious reflection, which are a function of my habitual associations, of the affections, the perceptions that I've had that I didn't notice taking place at the time. There's something to go to work on there, right? And the sort of, maybe paradoxical result of some of my line of argumentation here is like, and we should try to bring some of these ideas into conscious light. You know, on the one hand, I don't think that's a cure-all. You know, I still think that, bad ideas can continue to determine, but there's something for thought to do with a reason or a preference that has an unconscious basis, rather than for rejecting that there is any such reason or preferential basis at all, which I just find kind of I find that suggestion, politically unpleasant, but also intuitively implausible. I think people have reasons for why they do the things that they do. And, that's not to say that they always know what those are. And so this is like one way of kind of articulating what I think the idea of the unconscious is helpful for expressing, right? What's its prehistory prior to these thinkers? Like you said, the word consciousness doesn't show up until what did you say?
1678.
78, which is after Spinoza is already dead. And there's a book on the sort of long history and prehistory of the unconscious by John Shannon Hendricks. I think it's called Unconscious Thought in Philosophy. I think it's called. I may be getting that slightly wrong, but he identifies the sort of long prehistory going all the way back to like Neoplatonic ideas in people like, I think he talks about Proclus. He talks about some like medieval philosophers, Averroes, and there we have a kind of account of, just there's no name for this idea yet. And there isn't one, to be clear, really, in any of the thinkers that I'm working on in the book. There's no name for the unconscious. The closest we get is, on the one hand, as I mentioned, the sort of difference between perception and apperception in Leibniz. And there's like a line in Spinoza where he talks about infants or very young children who are quasi sui inscius, like as it were unaware of themselves. But that's not really the same yet, right? There's no explicit language for something like an unconscious dimension of the mind. But, there are thinkers prior to the ones who I'm focusing on who, recognize that something like that has to be at work if we're going to give satisfying accounts of things like preferences, of habits, of how memory works, right? Of how like associations tend to form and continue to be operative with or without my conscious voluntaristic assent. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how do the last part of your question was like, how did these thinkers take them up differently from one another? Well, in the book, the way that I emphasize it is that, we get a really robust way of thinking about unconscious perception or affection. In Leibniz, we get a way of thinking about how that has consequences for desire in Spinoza, which is as important as could be for him, given that as he, defines it, the actual essence of an individual is their desire, their striving, conatus. And, the fact that he's himself averring that, well, that doesn't mean that I'm conscious of what that is, what the sort of orientation and direction of my conatus is. That's going to have practical consequences. And in Hume, I think that he's sort of very attuned to the kind of continuous determining power of habituated ideas, again, quite explicitly, after having refuted them, right? I think that's a sea change moment for his practical philosophy as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on then something you were saying about both Leibniz and Spinoza's determinism. I first learned or was taught Leibniz and Spinoza by also a pretty eccentric reader of Leibniz, Pauline Femister at the University of Edinburgh. I think the first conversation I had with her, I went into her office and asked her about her recent paper, which was on whether dolphins have agency or something like that. But she's a Leibniz scholar, and she does all this really.
First of all, before we go any farther, do they?
Apparently.
All right, good enough for me. I buy it. That's fine.
I've lost my question now. No,
particular connection, Leibniz, Spinoza, determinism.
Yes. But one of the things that she really stressed in her reading of Leibniz, and what she thinks a lot of the scholarship on Leibniz and Spinoza tends to ignore, is that they seem to have fundamentally different understandings of determinism and of the kind of causal relation that coheres between things. Of course, for Leibniz, there's the principle of sufficient reason, which describes, I think he puts it this way, not only that something is, but how it is. Whereas for Spinoza, there's no question of a kind of realm of possibilities and then just one compossible world, which God brings about, because apparently that's something that a kind God does, in which there are the most things. I don't know. But what Pauline stresses, at least, is that While for Leibniz, there's a principle of sufficient reason, which is God selecting the best of all possible worlds out of a variety of possible worlds. For Spinoza, there's not really a principle of sufficient reason per se. There's just a principle of reason. There's no other way things could have been. They all follow with equal necessity from the nature of God or nature and its attributes. Does this difference between how determinism plays out in Leibniz and Spinoza have any kind of upshot for like what could be going on in the unconscious for them?
Cool. So I think so. So the reason why Leibniz gets to articulate, so first of all, like that's a very interesting set of observations and claims. And most commentators will say, I've said, that Spinoza is committed to something like a principle of sufficient reason. But it's interesting to draw this contrast. And the reason why it is because Leibniz needs a secondary principle to account for not just the possibility of a thing, but its actuality in addition, right? That, I can conceive of an infinity. God certainly can. Let's say maybe I can. God can conceive of an infinity of possible worlds, and yet only one of them is actual, right? So what's the principle according to which this world passes, if you like, from potentiality to actuality? And for that, it's not enough that there be the necessity of its possibility. I need a sufficiency of its actuality. So for him now, the two kinds of domains are going to be governed by different principles. The principle of non-contradiction establishes that domain, that infinite set of possibilities, none of which is compatible with the principle of non-contradiction. That's what makes it possible and not impossible that X world exists. But then the principle of sufficient reason is what accounts for that, not just the possibility, but the actuality of this world as given. Now, there's different ways of understanding what he thinks it means to say that this is the best of all possible worlds, most of which I think are actually very interesting and have a lot less to do with the kind of moral vision of the world that he's most, I think, often attributed as having, which I think he shares. But he usually says stuff like this world exhibits like an optimal ratio or proportion between the simplicity of the number of laws that govern its natural interactions and the diversity of the effects that come out of it. So that it is possible, for instance, for there is a possible world with fewer natural laws than the one that we've got, but there's so many fewer effects that it's a worse ratio between the two. Or again, like that there's a possible world with more diverse effects of nature, but you need to have so many more natural laws to get there that the proportion is off. He also sometimes talks about in other places, and there's a question then too of whether these are compatible conceptions, the one that I just articulated and this one, where he says things like, this is the world with possibles whose essences just have more force or reality to them. That like, if you like, they edge out the other possible worlds from being able to exist by virtue of the greater degree of reality perfection of the essences themselves. Fascinating stuff, right? And very little to do with like, oh, this is the world with the most happiness or something, right? Like the kind of very Voltaire Candide picture we get, I think, of Leibniz in a lot of cases.
Just before our conversation, we briefly mentioned Simone Weil. She has a weird take on this as well, which you might find amusing in passing, which is that she thinks an all-loving God, which creates the best of all possible worlds, creates the world in which there is a maximum of suffering. Because in such a world, there's the greatest distance between God and creation. So there's the greatest distance which can be crossed by their love and returning to him or something like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Of course. Yeah. What else could redemption mean without that gap, right? Or salvation. So yeah, soteriology driving the bus a little bit too hard for my taste here, but I get the logic. That works. Anyway, for Spinoza, like I made a joke about this on Twitter a while back that like, if you want Spinoza's take on this whole possible worlds question, his answer is they're all actual. The end. Full stop. If there is such a thing as a possible world, it's actual. And the reason for that is, not so much because like, of God's, almost never talks about this in terms of like God's moral virtues, right? It's not because of benevolence or charity or justice. He almost always falls back on omnipotence as like the sort of divine attribute which for him plays the most like sort of significant argumentative role. Anything less than God actualizing all possibles would testify to something less than omnipotence. Omnipotence means the power to create all that is possible, so that all that is possible is actual and in fact necessary as following from the divine essence for him. So yeah, no need for a gap to be explained between the possible and the actual or the necessary for him. And so, yeah, maybe principle of reason and not of sufficient reason. He also says things like that, his articulation of what we could call the PSR is like, there must be a reason, not just for everything that exists to exist in the way that it does, but also for everything that doesn't exist not to exist, right? So he's got a really strong articulation where even that which doesn't exist needs to have an account or an explanation for why it doesn't exist. How does this have implications, the sort of unconscious, determination of volition sorts of questions that I've been asking? Well, Leibniz does think that there are possibles that are unrealized, and that this plays a role in saving something like a doctrine of freedom, right? That I'm explaining this from the side of like their conceptions of freedom rather than from the side of determinism, but I think that they're two aspects of the same coin. So that like when you ask Leibniz what it means for an individual mind or monad to be free, one of the things he's always going to insist on is the contingency of things, right? That things aren't it's not a necessitarian picture, that things are contingent such that I can choose X rather than Y. And that's actually like a choice, that there's a choice there to be made. And for Spinoza, like that just falls out of the picture of freedom, committed to just a robust determinism as he is. For him, freedom means that I do what follows from my nature, that I produce the effects that follow from being the kind of being that I am within me and without me. And that I'm not suffering the influence of external causes, but rather, actively influencing the world around me. That's going to happen according to a logic of necessity, right? To what extent I'm able to do that, it is a deterministic picture. And so one of the things in some of my more recent work, I've been like making what I think are very annoying incursions into how Spinoza gets taken up by, especially like radical political thinkers who I think sweep away some of these issues, but it's genuinely a problem, I think, that needs to be taken seriously. That, for Spinoza, it just is true that like he thinks it's better, descriptively, not normatively, better to produce the effects that follow from your nature, to be free or to be active or joyful rather than to be sad and to undergo passions. And that the degree to which I'll be able to do that is going to be a deterministic process. And so I will make the mistakes that I'm going to make in a certain way. I have no ability to like abstract myself back, right? To sort of step back from my determination and say, okay, wait, what is the thing that I ought to be preferring here? It's more like, can I grab onto those ideas that in me are adequate as opposed to the ones that are inadequate, which expresses my ability to understand as a thinking thing. And so in that way is a joyful moment, a joyful process. Can I seize onto those and try to amplify that? I'm not going to be able to produce an adequate idea from nothing, but some of the ideas that I have are adequate. And the process then of kind of attempting to distinguish between those that express my power of understanding, my ability to act, and those that I can't, that I don't properly fully understand, which I only inadequately understand, which I imagine, which involve my projections of, a fictive human nature or a teleology in nature. All of that stuff, Spinoza thinks, is going to get in the way of my ability to act properly because it expresses something only confusedly. Now, like the one of the things that I try to say in the book is like, I don't mean to suggest that like adequate ideas are conscious, inadequate ideas. This is Spinoza's big typology. That's the two main kinds of ideas in his sort of picture are adequate and inadequate ideas. I don't think that it's the case for him that adequate ideas are conscious and, the inadequate ideas are the ones that are unconscious. I think that inadequate ones have components, have pieces of which we only have a little piece conscious to our minds, right? Inadequate idea, for instance, that I have of you, Kenneth, here now would be, the idea that I have, actually not even of you, but of how I am affected by this encounter. Right. That's an idea that I'm forming. And of you, I've got some of your nature involved in that idea, but also some of mine.
God damn it, give it back.
You can't. It's mine now. They'll never. No, don't worry. I'm not going to do anything with it. You can keep it. But there's like a mixture. Then there's a kind of confusion and an objective mixture, right? The idea that you and I have of each other involves both of our natures partially and obscurely. And to the extent that I think, oh no, I know who Kenneth is, right? I have this conscious idea of you. I'm making a mistake, right? I'm confusedly taking what is only a partial and kind of mixed up idea of your nature and treating it as though it is consciously available to me as the whole of who Kenneth is. And this is a mistake, and it will lead me to make mistakes, practically speaking. And so recognizing the sort of unconscious intermixture of ideas that happens when we encounter one another is, if you like, at least a kind of negative guardrail against some of the sorts of errors to which I might be prone, practically speaking, by, mistaking my partial idea of you, which has a bunch of unconscious stuff that I'm not aware of, with the complete concept of Kenneth Novis, which I don't have. Only God's got that,
I guess
so we gotta, I think, yeah. Go ahead,
it kind of goes the other way in Spinoza as well, doesn't it? While inadequate ideas are capable of being, they can have unconscious parts, sure, but they can also have conscious parts. For adequate ideas, they're ones which are primarily, in Spinoza at least, defined by their active presence in the infinite mind of God, right? He has this line, I think it's in Ethics Part 2, which says something like, any idea that is in the mind of God is an adequate idea, and an adequate idea, or anything that in us is an inadequate idea, in God has the form of an adequate idea, or something like this.
Yeah.
So it seems like, although there's this interplay between the conscious and the unconscious in inadequate ideas, adequate ideas are marked by their total availability to consciousness.
Totally.
Is that...
So I think that's right. There's one way to put this, which is that for God, all ideas would be conscious. If this isn't like a completely illegitimate anthropomorphic projection to say, but no ideas in God are unconscious at all. The thing is that for Spinoza, you have to understand ourselves as part of this dynamic field of ideas. We are ourselves ideas, and the idea that I am, my mind, is also populated by ideas of the things that I've encountered. So if you could kind of topologically represent this as I'm a little region. And again, when I have an encounter with a Kenneth Novis, there's a region called Kenneth as well that is involves other ideas that you've encountered and whatnot. And I have only a little bit of overlap between these two, right? Now there is
the ontology of the Venn diagram.
Yeah, the ontology of the Venn diagram, exactly. Yeah. There is in God a fully adequate idea of that thing that I encountered, that is you. But for me, I have access only to this part, just to this part of it. So, there is always something adequate in my inadequate encounter, my inadequate idea. But figuring out what that is tricky. And for Spinoza, it's always going to be a common nature, right? Whatever it is in the encounter that I have with you that is joyous, on the basis of which I can understand more, that testifies to a common nature between us. And that's not the same as, the singular idea of you, Kenneth Novis, right? At the same time, I have an adequate idea of something else, let's just say per hypothesis, that can still be mixed up with other inadequate ideas and with unconscious associations that I have, right? I have, let's just say for the sake of argument, a fully adequate idea of some person. But in my mind, I'm still associating that person because of the context in which I met them with a certain set of affective experiences. I associate them with music, with other people, and that might not be adequate, right? And I might not be conscious of those associations. So even when I have an adequate idea, that doesn't protect me from being able to be influenced and determined by the interplay between ideas as they're related to one another in my mind at an unconscious level, which is why it is possible for me to see the better and to affirm it and then to do the worse, right? I can adequately understand that, smoking is bad, right? Great. Who cares? That doesn't change anything about the shape and nature of my determination as a desiring being for whom there's a set of associations that I have with this stuff. And I don't think it's sufficient to try to account for that, right? Just in terms of a short-term versus long-term utilitarian calculus. It's not just I sometimes do the worse in the long run because I'm enticed by the short term. I think that he's got his finger on the pulse of a much deeper problem with what the constitution of desire looks like as something that's got a kind of irreducibly unconscious dimension or element, right? That the way that the ideas are tied to one another in memory, which is basically contingent for him. It's of the order of a contingent or random experience. That doesn't go away just because I have an adequate idea of a person, right? That stuff remains and continues to do real determining work in shaping how I live and what I do, which I think does have to change some of the questions that we ask about, like, what does it mean to try to, attain to freedom or to become active? I think that is a matter of like practical philosophy. Spinoza gives us a lot more here to work with than Leibniz does, cards on the table. But I think that Leibniz is, like I said, better about explaining what it means for there to be unconscious affections at all in the first place.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, while we're still on the Spinoza tangent, then I personally feel remiss if I didn't ask you about this one in particular, because I have a bugbear about certain popular interpretations of Spinoza and the way in which they use the scholium to Proposition 2, Part 3, which, the one that famously reads, "No one has yet determined what the body can do, what the body is capable of."
Right.
A lot of the time, the scholium and this line is used to attest to some sort of creative ontology in Spinoza's work, as though the capacities of the body are only brought into existence in the instant of an encounter. It's a way of attributing to him some sort of aleatory ontology. But all of the scholarly commentaries that I've read on this proposition suggest that it's really a part of Spinoza's proof of the unconscious of the body. You find this, for example, in Harry Wolfson's monstrous tome,
Oh yeah.
Spinoza's Ethics Unfolding the Latent Processes of His Thought.
Yeah.
Awful title as well. I don't know who let him pass with that one. But what I mean by that is this scholium comes up in Spinoza's attempt to explain how someone can fail to be aware of everything that happens in their body once it's accepted that the idea or the ideas which comprise the mind just are the ideas of the body and its parts. And that's to say something like, I don't have conscious awareness of when my blood vessels dilate or when my fingernails grow a couple millimeters or something. And at least that's how I interpret what's going on in that line and what's going on in Proposition Part 3. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this misinterpretation. At least in my eyes, it's pervasive. Maybe its significance for readings of Spinoza, or if you disagree with this way of reading that part.
Oh, I like this. Yeah, I'd say that, so yeah, Part 3, Proposition 2 is where in that scholium, he's got the pretty famous critique of, freedom of the will in its sort of spontaneous, or in my preferred way to talk about it, like a voluntaristic conception, right? And he says there's some of the funniest things that he says on the topic where, it doesn't experience teach the opposite, that if we could just keep our mouths shut, wouldn't we have a better time? And we know that, and we can't stop ourselves. And so, or the drunk thinks he freely chooses alcohol and the child thinks he freely chooses milk, and so on. The only funnier lines about that are where he says things like, if you could throw a stone through the air and ask it, it would tell you that it chose its trajectory, which very good. So when we say that we do not even know what the body can do, I think I get why people want to sort of flip that out into there being a kind of, like you said, like creative ontology of interactive aleatory encounter. Because it seems like, if we're talking about a mode like me, like my being a finite mode as a matter of corporeal substance, I don't know it, Spinoza says. I don't know what my body is or what my mind is as the sort of idea of that body, except in and through its affections, right? That is to say, in how it interacts with others, I learn from experience. This is where his arch rationalism kind of converges onto a sort of experimental empiricism or pragmatics. I don't know until I encounter something whether it's going to be good for me. If someone tells you that they can explain that a priori, I have bad news for you. That's not how this works. And so, what can my body handle? I don't know. Is that to say that that's the only context for actualization? I suppose. I think I'm like you a little bit hesitant about where some of this discourse wants to take the conclusions that one might draw from this. But I think I'm more sympathetic to what you're saying too, which is right, in Part 2, we get the definition of the mind as the idea of the body. And Spinoza says quite clearly, nothing can happen in the body that doesn't also happen in the mind, right? And to my mind, the language that I'm suggesting is best appropriate for talking about this a lot of the time, which Spinoza didn't have access to, was that, but a lot of those ideas are unconscious, right? Not every idea of everything that happens in my body is a conscious one. The question of which ones are conscious as opposed to others is, I think, a matter of, there's a couple of different ways I think we can talk about that. How does an unconscious idea cross a threshold of conscious awareness. And I think it's a matter of integration, degree of habitual recognition. What is its background, ideal context against which it could stand out as distinct or not? These are, again, all, sort of concrete, practical questions. But, I'm not usually aware of the blood in my body. Not often, sometimes, under very precise conditions, that turns out to be something that I can become conscious of. And by the way, Hume says the exact same thing in chapter 7, I think, of the First Enquiry, where he's trying to figure out where we've got this idea of necessary connection from. And he's like, oh, maybe you got this idea of like power or of necessary connection from the experience that you have of willing the body to do what you want. And he's like, really? Did you will the sinews? Did you will the beating of your heart? Did you will your liver to process what you drank? Like, no, none of that is voluntary. None of that has anything to do with your conscious understanding, or you don't even know how it works, let alone like I opted to do it, right? And it just seems like there is a class of cases where that's not true, because it sure feels like I chose to pick this up and drink it right now with my hand in a way that's totally unlike the involuntary, non-volitional way in which my heart beats without my sort of willing it to be so. For Spinoza, this is, I think, like you said, kind of attesting to the unconscious complexity of the body, and I would say therefore also that of the mind, right? Which, as the idea of the body has these dimensions of which conscious awareness like plays essentially no role. Can we become conscious of these ideas? Yes, again, under certain particular conditions. And the question is, practically speaking, what that ends up meaning. And sometimes the answer is very little, but sometimes it might be, well, this actually allows me to sort of drive a wedge between my sort of spontaneous intuitions about how this works and what's actually going on, the mechanisms of my determinism, right? Which can actually materially change how I go about doing what I do. So I don't know if that like completely responded to your question. And it's been a long time since I've looked at the Wolfson, because it is a massive, massive tome. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you responded to it anyway. But you brought up a concept there, which I was hoping we could actually close off this conversation with, of integration. Of course, in the conclusion to your book, you, as well as talking again about ideology, bring that concept up and mention how sort of it occupies this really important place in connecting the unconscious and the conscious in all of Leibniz, Spinoza, and Hume. So I was wondering if you could maybe say something about what integration is in this context.
Sure. I mean, it's going to have to be schematic, because this is something that I'm still trying to think through. I think that Leibniz has got the best resources for thinking this because of his sort of close connection with the calculus, where like, integration is an integration of differentials, and differentials.
We're going to have like angry STEM heads in the comments now. It's not his calculus, it's Newton's.
Oh, is it Newton's? Oh, is it the Royal Academy? Fight me. No, actually, I have no horse in that race, but just saying that of these three philosophers, let's just say Leibniz was acquainted with the differential calculus in ways that neither Spinoza, obviously, nor subsequently Hume would be. And this, by the way, is like connected to another sort of my ongoing research projects. I've been working a lot on Maimon, who sort of after Kant is resuscitating a lot of these early modern, first of all, Humean skeptical themes, but then also like metaphysical rationalist themes from Leibniz and Spinoza. And he has a lot to say about differentials in the sort of way that I think is helpful for this conversation. Helpful, although maybe too convoluted and difficult to make clear or intuitive. So I'm going to give it my best pass here. That the way that Leibniz is already talking about this in places like the New Essays, in places like the Principles of Nature and Grace, is that a conscious perception is one that is made up of an actual infinity of unconscious ones. It's somehow that these unconscious perceptions, which we can think of as differentials of consciousness or of perception, come together. They integrate in a certain sort of way. And in and through their relations with one another, cross a certain determinate threshold and become something distinct that I perceive. The nice example that he gives is like, you go to the shoreline and you listen and you hear a wave crashing. You hear the crashing of a wave. And you hear it as a wave crashing. You hear it as, a distinct one thing that you hear. But what is that? And at the limit, it has to be made up of an actual infinity of tiny, themselves imperceptible interactions of matter. This can go all the way down to an atomic molecular level, the vibration of an individual atom in its, or, vibration here maybe is a thing that has to exist between two atoms or atomic particles. I'm not conscious of that, but somehow their combined sort of integration into a one becomes a conscious thing that counts as a unity, And Leibniz's kind of, to my mind, still relatively unexplored suggestion is that this is not just a special case for when you go to the shoreline and listen to a wave, but that, the sort of becoming constituted as a distinct object, a distinct unity of conscious awareness, of perception, of experience, has this structure, that it's made up of a particular set of unconscious differentials. And then, something like the same could be said then for all of the sort of unconscious ideas that float around in what we call my memory, sometimes cohere in a moment of synthetic integration into a memory that I recall here and now, right? Which excludes some things, includes others, which and why, again, this is all experiential, pragmatically to be kind of explored for each of us individually. That, even at the level of when I interact with just a person, that there's so much. Nietzsche says something like this, I think, at some point, right? He says something like, if we couldn't forget, if we couldn't put out of our mind so much of the ways in which we're being affected, that experience would have been impossible, right? And I think that there's something like this now coming from the other side. How does this, infinite multiplicity of modes of affection, of which I am entirely, if not almost exclusively unconscious, get integrated into these distinct conscious experiences? There's more, I think, that needs to be said, but I think that asking questions like this can actually help bring into a kind of productive dialogue. Yeah, some of these early modern metaphysicians, but then, people like Maimon, later thinkers like Bergson say something similar about consciousness being an integration. And then the question is where the threshold of integrative unity is. In my, my sort of instinct is to suggest that that's itself a moving threshold, which will have to do with, the nature of my past habituation and what the certain set of unconscious affections that I'm currently undergoing are in relation with that history that makes up me, this mind, this body.
Well, that sounds like a great next book project to be working on. But it also brings us nicely on to the end of this conversation, because I normally like to ask people about what they have going on at the moment and what projects they have coming out. And I know from a past conversation with you that you're currently working on a translation of Martial Guerreau's book on Solomon Maimon. Is there anything else that you have going on at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm working on that, currently trying to find a place for a home for it. It's a really, really good book. Maimon is underappreciated. I'm trying to do some writing on his work for myself. I'm writing some stuff about the relationships between sort of my, early modern thinkers and the German idealists more broadly. Schelling and Maimon I'm both interested in for their, like I mentioned, kind of revitalization or recuperation of Spinozist and Leibnizian metaphysical themes after Kant's critical prohibition should have ruled them out. Presumably that didn't work, sorry to say. And then also Kant's and Maimon in dialogue with Hume on the question of skepticism, I'm really fascinated with. The Giroux book is really, really interesting to me. Yeah, I think also, I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about this yet, but the Zerbichvili book that I recently translated, coming out soon with Edinburgh University Press, is Spinoza's Paradoxical Conservatism. It's great. I hope I've done it justice. And I think I will be translating his other book. So in 2003, Zerbichvili wrote 2 books on Spinoza. That's the one, and the other is called A Physics of Thought. And so I'll be working on that with a friend and collaborator soon. Like I said, I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about that yet, but that's the sort of stuff I've got in the works. I stay busy producing my podcast, which you mentioned at the start. What's Up to Philosophy comes out every 2 weeks. Next episode will be dropping a week from, well, we're recording it today is the 24th, but next Monday it'll be on Ernst Bloch and Utopia. And yeah, that's kind of what I got going on at the moment.
Perfect. Well, I can't wait to read some of these translations you have coming up. As always, the articles you put out are regularly appreciated by me. Always great stuff going on the podcast as well. So thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Kenneth. This was a great discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks so much.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.